This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. St. Patrick's Day is coming up, and historian Terry Golway tells us how the Irish political machine known as Tammany Hall became the forerunner of the New Deal. Regular commentator Fred Rotondaro compares President Obama to a couple of Republicans, Teddy Roosevelt and George H.W. Bush. And Bill Press talks with Maryland Congressman John Sarbanes about big money in Washington. Are you tired of Tea Party Republicans and Rush Limbaugh dominating the airwaves? Do you want the facts you won't get on Fox or even on CNN? Then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen. Then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. Tammany Hall no longer exists, but when it did, the New York political machine created a social safety net at the neighborhood level long before government programs came along. Author Terry Golway thinks we still need strong political organizations like that. And joining us now on americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats, Terry Golway is a professor at Keene University in New Jersey. He's a historian, author, and a journalist who has written for the New York Times and the New York Observer. And his latest book is Machine Made, Tammany Hall, and the Creation of Modern American Politics. Terry Golway, thank you so much for joining us today on americasdemocrats.org.
It's my pleasure.
Now, you've written a history of an institution that lasted maybe over a century, but which most of our listeners really don't know about. What was Tammany Hall, and what role did it play in national Democratic politics?
Well, Tammany Hall was both a building, which is to say, it was a meeting hall, and it also was the controlling faction of the Democratic Party in Manhattan. So in essence, when we talk about Tammany Hall, we're talking about the Democratic Party in New York, but specifically Manhattan. That was sort of their geographical center. And, because Tammany Hall existed at a time when New York was a political colossus. I mean, New York in the early to mid-20th century had the most number of electoral votes, and it produced the Democratic Party's presidential candidate from 1928 all the way to 1944. So it was the center of Democratic politics in the same way that today you might argue that Texas is the center of Republican politics. There was New York, and then there was the rest of the country. And Tammany Hall, as the leading Democratic faction in New York, had a very large influence over national politics in the early to mid-20th century.
What role did Irish immigrants play in the development of Tammany? And was it a class warfare thing against New York's Dutch and British elites, kind of a continuation of the Irish Anglo Wars of old?
Absolutely. When the Irish began coming to New York and to the rest of the country in large numbers in 1847, which is when the famine breaks out in Ireland, during the course of 5 years in Ireland, the population went from 8 million to 5 million. 1 million people starved to death in Ireland, and 2 million people emigrated. Many, of course, came to the United States. Many come to New York. And there are two kinds of reaction. Not just in New York, but in Boston and other places. One reaction is that of the nativists, who say, who are these people? They are aliens. They have a different sort of religion. Many of these Irish people did not speak English. They spoke Irish. They were different. They were un-American. They were unworthy of what was seen to be a Protestant republic. That was one reaction. Then there was a reaction of organizations like Tammany Hall, which said, these people could be voters. We can assimilate them into America. We can make them our allies. Now, of course, there's some self-interest going on there, but if you're an immigrant and you come to these shores, you have hostility on one end and friendliness on the other. Well, which side are you going to choose? But the other thing that the Irish immigrants recognized was as you suggested, the same sort of cultural attitudes that they had experienced in Ireland, where their religion was considered a mark of inferiority, where their culture was considered inferior. So they leave Ireland where they're oppressed, and they come to New York and other places where civic elites are basically saying, well, you're not worthy of liberty. You're Irish. You're Catholic. You're lazy. You don't understand these elite concepts of freedom. So the language of reform was very similar in New York as it was in Ireland, and the Irish reacted accordingly. They went with an organization, Tammany Hall, that did not presume to judge them from a cultural standpoint. All they wanted to do was assimilate them.
Yeah, machines like Tammany nominated people for office in the smoke-filled back rooms. In a way, didn't that produce better leaders than nominating them through low-turnout primaries? kind of like what we do today.
Well, yeah.
I mean, the reference here is to what is happening now in the Republican Party.
Well, exactly. And I listen. I don't think anybody wants to go back to the days where a boss of a large organization sits down with his all-white male, cigar-smoking colleagues and decides on who will be the nominee. But there's no question, though, that system worked quite often. I mean, I would argue that it worked. It reached its zenith in 1944 when the bosses in a back room chose Harry Truman to be the vice president in place of Henry Wallace, for Franklin Roosevelt's fourth term. I think that was a very wise choice by these bosses. And I think that history has proven that Truman was a pretty darn good president, and Henry Wallace might not have been a very good president. So I think that the reference to a smoke-filled room these days is often a pejorative. It's often seen as the absolute symbol of corrupt government. I think that we have to rethink that and perhaps acknowledge that the system, however flawed, that system actually did work on occasion.
For that time.
For that time, absolutely.
Yeah. We're speaking with Terry Golway, professor at Keene University in New Jersey, a historian, author. He's written for the New York Times and the New York Observer, and his latest book is Machine Made, Tammany Hall and the Creation of Modern American Politics. Tammany Hall was the epitome of a big city political machine, which most people might think is a bad thing. But wasn't it really a model of retail politics where leaders listened to the people where they lived and actually provided a social safety net?
There's a reason, yes, absolutely. There's a reason why Tammany Hall succeeded, and that's because it responded to its constituents' needs. There was a famous Tammany figure by the name of George Washington Plunkett, and he's famous because a political reporter in the early 20th century walked around with him several days and just spent the day writing up his monologues, and it was turned into a book. And on one particular day that this reporter by the name of William Reardon, he spent the day with Plunkett as he went about his duties as a district leader, which is sort of a mid-level operative within the Tammany organization. And the day started with a knock on Plunkett's door at 4 o'clock in the morning or something like that because some local kid got in trouble and needed to be bailed out. The day starts with that and ends at midnight, and the story of what this guy did during those many hours will tell you exactly why this organization succeeded, because he's constantly meeting with constituents, meeting with people who are in touch with other constituents. I mean, his full-time job is listening to constituents, not listening to donors. Right? And I think there's the big difference between the politics of yesterday and the politics of today. George Washington's Plunkett day was spent 15, 16, 17 hours of dealing with constituents instead of, dealing with would-be donors and trying to shake money out of contributors. So these organizations had their finger on the pulse of the needs of their voters, and that's why they succeeded. I think that a lot of historians argue that machines like Tammany succeeded because they intimidated voters or because, and this is the part that I really hate, that voters were too stupid and too ignorant to recognize their own interests. I disagree profoundly, and my book makes the argument that these voters knew exactly what they were doing, that Tammany was responsive to their needs, and other political organizations too, and when they failed to respond to those needs, they suffered at the polls. It was that simple.
Mm-hmm. Is there a role today for urban political organizations like Tammany anymore? I mean, maybe that kind of organization's been replaced by advocacy groups or even by social media?
Yes, I do think that they have been replaced by social media and advocacy groups, but I do think there's still a place for the old-fashioned political clubhouse. And you know what? There still are a few in New York, and I imagine there are a few in Boston and Chicago and some of the old places, but there's actually still a remnant of Tammany Hall 50 years after it collapsed on 9th Avenue in Hell's Kitchen. There's a place called the McManus Association where if you're a constituent, you can go into that clubhouse. You know, you need help maybe with a matter of law enforcement, or you need a job, or you need some training. There are people working in that political organization who will try and match you up with the bureaucracy or try to advocate for you with the local politicians. And, you know, I think that if there were a better and stronger connection between local neighborhoods in urban areas and politics, maybe we would see greater political participation. And after all, isn't that what we're supposed to be all about?
You know, there's an anecdote you mentioned about Al Smith campaigning to repeal Prohibition and warning that pretty soon you won't be able to stand at 42nd Street and Broadway and smoke a cigar. That pretty much came to pass under Mayor Bloomberg, did it not?
Yeah, that's exactly why I have it in the book. And you know, I had no idea that I was going to come across that anecdote, but I did see that Smith was speaking at the opening of the Tammany Hall building in 1929, and that building still exists over by Union Square in Manhattan. And he's railing on about Prohibition. Tammany was against Prohibition. And, of course, in 1929, a fair amount of the country was against Prohibition, at least in urban areas. And Smith was saying, you know, listen, if they want to control your drinking, and before you know it, you're not going to be able to, as you said, smoke a cigar on the corner of 42nd and Broadway. And I write in the introduction, I said, most of the people in the audience probably thought this was inconceivable. And, of course, here we are in 2014, and it is actually quite believable.
Yep. And by the way, put down that large soda. Terry Golway, professor at Keene University in New Jersey. His latest book is Machine Made, Tammany Hall and the Creation of Modern American Politics. Terry, we very much enjoyed your time with us today on americasdemocrats.org, and hopefully we can do it again soon.
It's my pleasure. I look forward to it.
All right, and this is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to Democrats for America's Future and help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. Domestic policy will be President Obama's legacy, but his foreign policy is sound, says regular commentator Fred Rotondaro, and we'll talk to him about that in just a minute. Right now, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
Okay, climate change deniers, you've gone too far. You've gone from just being annoying know-nothings to now posing a serious threat to an essential good that embodies humankind's finest collaboration with nature, beer. It's one thing for the science denial cult to stand in the way of doing something about melting ice caps in the Arctic, but it's another thing altogether for them to mess with beer. This makes it personal. While the deniers keep doing their denial dance, California is drying up. The higher temperatures caused by climate change has produced an ongoing drought that has, among other bad things, caused a precipitous drop in the water level of Lake Mendocino, which could come close to being a dry lake bed this summer. What has that got to do with beer? Glad you asked. Mendocino feeds the Russian River, which flows by the town of Petaluma, home of Lagunitas Brewing Company, which makes very fine beers. A key ingredient in the Lagunitas brew is the excellent water the company draws from the Russian River, which presently is in danger of becoming a trickle. Can't Lagunitas and other breweries along the river just switch to groundwater? No. The head beer master at Lagunitas notes that heavy minerals in that water would cause it to fizz in the brewing process. Plus, there are concentrations of nitrates, iron, and manganese in the area's groundwater, creating issues of odor, taste, and other unpleasantries that do not add up to good beer. This is Jim Hightower saying, what the Lagunitas experience is teaching us once again is that the nature of nature is that all things are linked together, despite the fantasies of industry shills who insist that their contaminants have no dire consequences. Mess with the global climate, and you mess with Lake Mendocino, which messes with the Russian River, which messes with the beer. And now you're messing with me and millions of other beer drinkers. Like I said, it's personal.
This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. Analyst Fred Rotondaro says Republicans blame President Obama for everything that goes wrong in the world, but his foreign policy is actually strong, speaking softly and carrying a big stick. And we welcome once again to our program, americasdemocrats.org, Fred Rotondaro, who's a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress, contributor to the Huffington Post, of course, is a regular contributor to americasdemocrats.org. Also active in the lay Catholic community, especially on social issues. As always, Fred Rotondaro, thanks very much for joining us on americasdemocrats.org.
Thank you, Jim. As always, a great delight to be here.
Nice to have you with us. So let's start with politics. What do you think the chances are of Democrats retaining control of the Senate this year and picking up seats in the House?
I think both are going to happen. I would be astonished if Democrats don't retain control of the House. I even looked at someone like Mitch McConnell losing to the Democratic candidate in Kentucky. And I just don't see Republicans being able to pick up any seats in the House. I think Democrats will pick up more seats. Republicans will lose some seats. I don't think, sadly, that Republicans will lose control of the House. So how I wish that would happen, but I don't see it happening.
Yeah, that's a pretty big hill to climb right there, I think.
Yeah.
The thing about Mitch McConnell that you mentioned, too, he's got a lot of pressure from within his own party to somebody who's actually, believe it or not, more conservative than he. He's got the Tea Party steaming down his neck, too.
He really does. Mitch McConnell, I think, is a pretty bright guy. I think he's got a great belief in being the party leader. He believes in that. But frankly, he's conservative, but his main obligation is to the corporations that fund him.
Yeah.
A month or so ago, whatever it was, at the CPAC meeting, Mitch McConnell showed up on stage carrying a rifle and handing it to a retired Senator Tom Coburn. When I think a minority leader of the U.S. Senate gets that desperate and has to pull such a cheap and trite stunt, appealing to the rafters, you know that he knows he's got a little bit of trouble.
Yeah, absolutely. How do you see politics of the budget, with President Obama giving lip service to taxing the rich and strengthening the safety net, but at the same time leaving years of domestic spending cuts in place?
I don't think that he is giving lip service to taxing the rich. I think this ultimately has got to be part of his legacy. He's got to change what is happening with low-income America and with middle-income America, or he's just not going to get. He's just not going to have the kind of legacy he really does want. He's still willing to cut a deal with Republicans, but I think that willingness is fading by week by week by week. I think he should realize by this time he's not going to cut a deal with the Republicans, and he should go for pretty much everything he possibly can get.
Well, that's even if he cuts a deal. If he cuts a deal, at what cost?
Oh, I think if he cuts a deal cuts a deal in the way that he was trying to do stuff in the first year or 2 years of his administration, his progressive base is just going to revolt and go after him.
Right.
There's only so much he can do. The reality is that America is at a stage where, in regard to the rich, the poor, the middle class, we are at a make-or-break stage where we are going to either change America in the future in ways that we simply don't want to tolerate, and that I think would have the progressives blow up against President Obama.
We're speaking with Fred Rotondaro, Senior Fellow at the Center for American Progress, contributor to the Huffington Post, as well as AmericasDemocrats.org, of course. You mentioned changing the country. Is immigration reform dead for the foreseeable future?
I think it pretty much is. Very, very sadly, John Boehner has stuck his neck out on one or two causes. I just don't see him going for very much beyond that. And I think that President Obama is going to do as much as he can, as he said he would, with executive orders. But I don't really see any major immigration changes coming.
Mm-hmm.
I should point out that my one-time boss, as you pointed out, I'm a senior fellow at the Center, and John Podesta started the Center. John was President Clinton's last chief of staff. But in the last couple of years of the Clinton regime, John, especially as chief of staff, was figuring out how to get things done when you were dealing with a Congress that was just nigh onto impossible and that objected to your every move. And I think that Podesta, who is the constitutional lawyer, is going to be over at the White House. He's cut all connection with the Center for American Progress. But I think Podesta, who's a very smart and wily guy, is over there looking to see how we can get this stuff done by going around or, if need be, through Congress.
Mm-hmm. You know, there has been a sea change in American politics regarding same-sex marriage and marijuana or legalization. Are those things that signal a resurgence of progressive values, or are they just the reality of many conservatives smoking pot and being gay?
Oh, I think it's the latter. I really do. I think America is simply becoming so much more pluralistic, particularly with young people. I look at my kids. My kids are 32 now and 35, and their friends are such a wide, crazy mixture of people, and they don't judge other young people on whether they're gay. They judge them sometimes. My kids do, at least, on whether they smoke cigarettes. Because they say if you're smoking cigarettes, you try to make a statement, and boy, don't you know these things are going to kill you in the long run. They just look upon that as being stupid.
Right.
But if you're gay, if you smoke a little pot, I don't think it matters to these young people, and that's permeating up through society and with parents.
Mm-hmm. Again, we're speaking with Fred Rotondaro, Senior Fellow at the Center for American Progress. Looking far ahead into 2016, although it's funny because it seems like it's right around the corner, do you think Hillary Clinton has the Democratic nomination for the asking? No, I do not. I do think I would be very surprised if she doesn't get it. Democrats are going to be like the Republicans this time around. It's a feeling that it's her turn. She has so much support at all levels of the party. I would be amazed if she doesn't get it. The only way I can see her not getting it is if she runs a similar campaign, and by similar I mean the 2008 campaign for Hillary Clinton was not particularly well executed or well thought out. But I just don't see that happening. And I don't see anybody on the left who is going to challenge her. Elizabeth Warren could, although she said she will not. People like Martin O'Malley, Andrew Cuomo, a couple of others would
probably want to jump in, as of course would Vice President Biden.
Mm-hmm.
But I do think that it's Hillary's to lose at this stage of the game.
What about John Kerry?
Oh, I don't see John Kerry coming back. He is right now, I think he's 68. I could be wrong. But John Kerry would be 72. Joe Biden would be 74. Hillary is going to be 68 in 2016. I think being Secretary of State, this is the ultimate for John Kerry. I think he's handling it very, very well. I don't see him trying to make a return running for president.
Mm-hmm. All right, well, let's go back to Hillary. If she is going to run on her accomplishments, there aren't that many as Secretary of State, are there? I mean, and they're really...
That's true.
And there are, negatives like Benghazi and the reset with Russia. There's already some baggage building up, and that's more recent stuff from her more recent role as Secretary of State. So
yeah, I think Benghazi has pretty well run its course. Representative Darrell Issa of the House Operations Committee at a fundraiser in California for his own people was caught on camera saying that Hillary Clinton gave the order to stand down to the American military when in Benghazi when the consulate was being attacked. He was called out for it because it's so blatantly a lie by Fox News of all places. Benghazi, I think, will have run its course. It's a rallying cry for Republicans because it's simple. It plays to the theme that Hillary and the president are really outsiders who don't have loyalty to the country. But it's such a lie. It is such an incredible lie. That will really go nowhere. I think Hillary's biggest attribute, and this is going to be strange, is that people think she's competent, which she is, and people think she's tough, which I think a lot of folks like. Last year, White Kathy and I were at a party in Maine where we try to get up a couple of weeks every summer at least. And we were talking to three men we know, all retired, all businessmen, all solid Republicans. And each and every one of them attacked President Obama, but said we could vote for Hillary Clinton for president. And what they were saying was, she's tough. We need an authoritative leader. And I think Hillary would do very, very well in the general election. I just don't. I see her as a nominee. I see her as the solid winner in 2016.
You also think about her experience on so many different levels. She's been a spouse.
Oh, yeah.
She's been a spouse in the White House. She's been a senator. I mean, she's been all over the place. I mean, she has
been all over the place. And I saw somewhere, I forget where, but Republicans, John McCain and Lindsey Graham, no big fans of the Democrats, were both several years ago praising Hillary Clinton. They served together. I think it was on the Armed Services Committee. Apparently got along very, very well. And John McCain, who's as big a hawk as you're going to want to find any place, apparently likes her, has praised her publicly in the past. She has the virtue of appearing strong. And this is a virtue that Republicans like. They like these, let me go ahead and make a decision kind of leader. And Hillary comes across very, very well that way.
Okay. Well, we're out of time for this one, Fred, but of course we will certainly have you back here on americasdemocrats.org. But as always, we appreciate your time today and look forward to doing it again soon.
Thanks, Jim. I look forward to it myself.
Thank you. And this is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for Stand Up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to Democrats for America's Future to keep this show on the air and help elect Stand Up Democrats. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is americasdemocrats.org, the weekly netcast for stand-up Democrats. And now, Bill Press and his guest, Congressman John Sarbanes of Maryland.
Can't tell you how often when we get into, no matter what the issue is, and talk about what we can do about it, that we inevitably get a call from one of our listeners or one of our viewers saying, well, you know, we're never going to fix this problem unless we do something about campaign finance reform and campaign contributions. It is the number one problem underlying everything else that we care about in this country. And nobody knows that better, and nobody's doing more about it than Congressman John Sarbanes from the state of Maryland, joining us in studio again this morning. Congressman, welcome back.
Bill, thanks very much.
Good to see you. It looked like you're surviving Congress. I don't know.
Well, I'm trying. It's a tough place to be. You know, the public's pretty angry with Washington and Congress. They have a right to be. I think, as you said, a lot of it has to do with this feeling that the big money crowd kind of runs everything in Washington, and the voices of everyday citizens are being left behind. So the question is, what do we do to address that cynicism out there?
I have to ask you, when we get into exactly what you're doing about it, but how does it feel to be sitting there in the Congress yesterday and being part of the number 50 vote to repeal Obamacare? I mean, what are they thinking?
Well, you know, the definition of insanity, right, is trying the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. And there's just this, you have this group that refuses to accept that this is the law of the land. We're to the implementation stage. Obviously, there's been some bumps in that, but, you know, millions of people are starting to benefit from this health care reform, and we got to keep moving forward with it. So it's very frustrating to have the Republicans continue to bring these repeal things up, but we'll prevail. You
have tackled, back on what we wanted to talk about particularly here, you have tackled this campaign finance reform head on with your Government by the People Act. I mean, there's an original phrase, but
well,
it's good to get back to it.
Abe Lincoln's a pretty good guy to take cues from,
right.
And so we thought we would do that. The Government by the People Act, which we introduced a month ago, is really designed to put everyday citizens back in the center of things and to give their voice some kind of say, because they believe, and they're right, you know, the Americans are smart about this stuff. They've figured out that big money is kind of running things in Washington, and a lot of that's because they are the ones pouring money into campaigns. So it's no surprise that when it comes time to vote on public policy, the Congress tends to lean in the direction of big money and special interest,
absolutely,
and away from what everyday people want to see.
Right. So how do you change that? I mean,
what we've done is we've created a system that first would encourage everyday folks to get into the sort of business of funding campaigns by offering what we call the My Voice tax credit. It's a refundable $25 tax credit for contributions to congressional campaigns. That'll make it easier for everyday people to say, you know what, I'll step up and I'll make a small donation and start becoming part of the solution so that my voice powers campaigns instead of the voices of big money and special interest. The second thing we do is we establish under the bill something we call the Freedom from Influence Matching Fund. So what this is it's a matching fund that comes in behind those small donations, boosts them up, and means that candidates and members of Congress will start paying more attention to the small donor because that can generate some real dollars.
Dollar for dollar match, you mean?
It's actually a multiple match. So you make a small donation of $10, that can turn into a $70 contribution for that candidate with a 6-to-1 match. So now the candidate has some real incentive to have that house party and come collect your $20, $50 contribution instead of going to some fancy affair on K Street and collecting dollars that way.
Well, who's paying? Who pays for that?
So that would be a public fund. And people say, well, yeah, exactly. How are you going to pay for this? Well, one way you can pay for it, I think, is look at the industries who have benefited from these loopholes for years because they wield so much influence in Washington. The oil and gas industry, which is getting $5 billion a year in taxpayer subsidies, even though they are getting billions of dollars of profits every year. They don't need taxpayer money. Close that loophole, take some of those funds, and underwrite a system that can match small donors. Or maybe we go to Wall Street, which is benefiting from huge tax loopholes. And why? because over decades they've been pouring money into campaigns, buying influence on Capitol Hill to preserve those loopholes. So you shut down some of the loopholes from the very industries that wield that influence in Washington. Take those dollars, you can underwrite a system of matching small donors for decades.
So this is, I mean, for a long time that I've been involved in politics, it was public campaign financing, just getting all the money out and public. This is sort of a modified version of it, right? And
it's a hybrid. It's a hybrid. What it says is, okay, we're going to come behind the small donor. We're going to boost their voice, because right now, if you're a $10, $15 donor, you say, my voice doesn't matter. How does it compete against super PACs and PACs and so forth? And you're right. But if you have a matching system, then that small donor comes along and says, hey, my $10 is actually worth $60 or $70. Before you know it, you start assembling that, and that's real money to help a candidate.
Has anybody tried this in the real world?
Actually, at the state level, there are experiments like this, systems in place. New York City has a system. Connecticut has sort of a variation on it. Maine has a public financing system. And what you find is when these are in place, not only do you empower everyday citizens, which helps address that cynicism and anger they're feeling so they don't feel left out anymore, but you get different kinds of candidates who can run for office and win.
Right. Mm-hmm.
I mean, I was with a legislator from Maine who said, but for the public funding system up in Maine, she would not be in the state legislature. She's a cashier. She knows tons of people, but not people with a lot of money.
Yeah.
But you put a public funding system in place, she can be competitive. We would get different people running for Congress, Bill, if we had this kind of a system in place. Half the people in Congress right now are millionaires. Why is that? Because it takes millions of dollars to run for office. You create a system that gives everyday citizens a voice, they'll start putting forward candidates who can be competitive, who really represent their interests.
But isn't there a real big brick wall like in front of you? And his name is John Roberts, and he's probably got another 30 years on the Supreme Court. And as long as he is there, you know damn well that if this bill becomes law, he'll overturn it.
He won't overturn it. We vetted this. It passes constitutional muster because it's a voluntary system. So candidates choose to participate. And if it's a voluntary system and not a mandated system, the court is not going to overturn it. We actually have a third piece which would help candidates that face an onslaught of super PAC money or outside money in the final days of a campaign, where they could get some additional resources to help fight back, keep their voice in the game. And we even designed that so that it will pass constitutional muster under this court. So we're not worried about a challenge from the court. What we want to do is create a system that candidates will choose to participate in, and we think we've done that.
Now, what do you find from your colleagues in the House right now? Do they feel threatened by this? Because, I mean, the game is, and I was former Democratic chair of California. I was right in the middle of it. You don't like the system the way it is now, but if you want to win, you sort of got to play by the rules of the game. So a lot of your members spend a lot of their time dotting for dollars every day.
A tremendous amount of time.
Now, so what are they?
I think people are attracted to this.
We
introduced this with 128 original co-sponsors.
Really?
So on the day of introduction, we had a broad group that was supporting this. I think because they're talking to their constituents. And look, they know how disgusted people are with Washington and Congress. And a lot of that has to do with this feeling that your voice can't be heard and that big money is running everything. So we offer a solution for that, and I think they know that's going to be compelling to their constituents, and that's why they're getting behind this bill. And frankly, they're looking for a different system. Mm-hmm. Members of Congress don't like having to go to the PACs and the big money to run these campaigns, but right now there's no alternative to that. Create a system that's powered by everyday citizens, and you'll see candidates and members of Congress turn back in that direction.
So if this passes, then it's up to each
member decides,
each member.
Do they want to participate? And we've made it attractive enough that a candidate would look at this and say, I can run a viable campaign and be competitive by choosing a system that puts everyday citizens back in the middle and begins to turn away from the big money and the special interests. That's the kind of system we need.
One member of Congress who's got enough guts to stand up and take on the big money in politics, Congressman John Sarbanes from Maryland, here in the studio with us. Right now we're visiting with Congressman John Sarbanes from Maryland, who is out in the lead with a bill called Government by the People Act on the important issue of campaign finance reform. Congressman, Harry Reid's been talking about two players that you just mentioned. The Koch brothers. He went to the floor of the Senate yesterday to tell people what he thinks about the Koch brothers. Here's Majority Leader Reid.
You see, when you make billions of dollars a year, you can be just as immoral and dishonest as your money will allow you to be. It's too bad that they're trying to buy America, and it's time that the American people spoke out against this terrible dishonesty of two brothers who are about as un-American as anyone that I can imagine.
Pretty strong language, but buying America is not an exaggeration, is it?
That's what they're trying to do, and with every passing day, they get more traction on that agenda. So the American people have to take their government back. They have to. I mean, look at it this way: somebody's going to own the government, right? Either it's going to be big money and special interests, in which case, when it comes time to make policy, that's the direction we'll lean in on public policy, or it's going to be the American people. You create a system that matches small donations with matching dollars that come in behind that. And everyday citizens, real Americans, can own their government again and get results.
Now, you're trying to get this bill through Congress, and of course, you've got John Boehner and Eric Cantor against you. They probably won't even schedule it for a vote. Meantime, is there any way people around the country, all of our people coast to coast, can get involved in
Absolutely.
this?
We're not waiting. There's a national coalition, more than 40 national organizations, including civil rights groups like NAACP, environmental groups like the Sierra Club, labor. We have SEIU and UAW, and CWA has been a real lead on this effort. They're pushing out petitions online. We already have 400,000 citizen co-sponsors. I've got a platform, the Government by the People, peopleact.com. You can go there. Public Campaign has a site, www.ofby.us, ofby.us. So you can go there and sign a petition. Just put in Government by the People Act, Google it, and you'll land on one of these petition platforms. Sign that, add your voice to the almost 500,000 people who have already said we need this kind of reform. I think this can be a movement, Bill. It's not something that's going to happen overnight. It's not going to cure the whole problem. But it's a very important first step for people to say, doggone it, we're sick of somebody else owning our government. We want our democracy back.
And they could also get some things going, I would imagine, at the state level, too, right?
No question. There are efforts in a number of states across the country, and there are examples like New York City has a system like this that matches small donations. But people should also go to their members of Congress and say, we want you to get behind this bill. We already have over 135 co-sponsors. We'd love to add to that to keep the momentum going. The point is that when the window of opportunity presents itself, and that's not tomorrow, and it's probably not next week, but when it comes, we want to be ready to take advantage of it. And by building this citizen support across the country for real reform, I think we'll be able to do that.
Let's say hello to Ryan, calling from Chicago on the great WCPT. Hello, Ryan. Good morning.
Good morning. Your two guests today give me faith that Congress can be turned around a little bit. So thank you for having both of them on.
Well, thank you. Tim Bishop from New York and John Sarbanes from Maryland. Right. Go ahead, Ryan.
I think this is a great idea, and I think that people will definitely get behind it. In my opinion, it's the biggest problem, and I've seen it for years. But when Citizens United went down, I was like totally deflated because it just was like this could be the beginning of the end if people just don't get involved and do something about this. But I wanted to ask the congressman, and I know that you probably
come on, Ryan, get to the question.
Why is it? How are you guys going to get anything done in 94 days? In session this year.
Okay, all right. That's good. Thanks, Ryan. Good to hear from you. Are you going to get anything done in 94 days this year?
You mean the balance of this election cycle?
Yeah.
No, we're not going to get anything done. The Republicans don't have any interest in getting anything done. It's all about politics for them now. We're in an election year. They're putting together their talking points. That's all they really care about.
All around Obamacare.
And that's why it's important this fall for Democrats who don't like the current situation in Washington, or let me change that, any American citizen, whether they're a Democrat or Republican or independent, who's fed up with the gridlock and the dysfunction and rightly puts the blame for a lot of that on the House leadership, ought to go to the polls and try to change the composition of the Congress so we can begin to get some things done. But on this money issue, I want to make the point that whoever's in charge, until we get the influence of big money out of the system, we're only going to make but so much progress. And that's why it's important for us to build a system that puts everyday citizens back in the middle. And when we designed this legislation, the Government by the People Act, it had to meet two standards. One, it had to be viable so candidates would participate. But most importantly, everyday folks needed to look at this thing, kick the tires on it, and say, you know what, this isn't just a gimmick. This isn't just cosmetic. They built this for us. This puts us back in charge. That's what we wanted to do. That's what I think we have done.
Right. And, again, whether you care about education or the environment or whatever your issue is, this is where you got to start. You got to fix this first.
Absolutely. All the substantive agendas start with fixing this process of how we fund our campaigns.
That's all for americasdemocrats.org. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. Terry Golway, Fred Rotondaro, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook. For americasdemocrats.org, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us, support the show, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate.